Good morning. This is Luke Caderouza. Today's topic on the Living a Satisfying Life is mental illness. You know, the purpose of our podcast is to feature ordinary people doing extraordinary things that better the human condition. Our guest this week is Eva Ritvo. Her contribution to the difficult problem of mental illness that is facing our country. I personally had the privilege of meeting Ellen when seeking advice on how best to deal with a family member who was diagnosed with a mild case of schizophrenia. Her compassion and guidance helped me to figure out how best to deal with that family issue. So, in hopes that this conversation will give you the hope to take action by contacting Ellen or her organization, NAMI, because they are there for you. And I will post all of that information, contact information on the Living SOS website and with the contact information. And hopefully you will enjoy this extremely important topic with Dr. Eva and Eva Ritvo. So here they are.
Hi. Today we're fortunate to be with Eva Ritvo, who's the president of her local NAMI chapter, and she's going to explain to us what NAMI is and what her role is there and how we can all access these really valuable resources. So thank you for taking your time to be with us this morning, Ellen.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for having me. NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, has been around since 1979. It's the oldest and largest, I don't know about the oldest, but it's the largest grassroots organization, mental health organization in the country. It is national, it is statewide, and then it is the affiliates do the work. Each one has its job, like in every charity. It's a 501c3, and we run basically on donations and grants. Our purpose, our mission, is to support, educate, and advocate for people struggling with a mental health condition and their families, as well as faith groups, clergy, teachers, anybody who has any influence on people struggling, which is probably almost everybody. We go out into schools and we table, and it's something that has been come into focus since COVID.
That at least is one of the benefits, is that people have become much more aware of how important mental health is. Access has become easier. So I think those are at least two benefits that we can identify from this pandemic. Otherwise, as my daughter and I like to say, we do not recommend pandemic. 10 out of 10 do not recommend a pandemic. Really very, very exhausting, very stressful. And because of that, we've seen rates of mental illness across the board, anxiety, depression, substance abuse on the rise. Has NAMI been busier over these last several years?
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, as you said, the COVID or the pandemic had a silver lining of, putting us into the Zoom age, the more of the technology. And I think actually people may not like this, but it actually brought awareness to mental health conditions. And so when you're aware, hopefully you can get support. And when people look for support is when a mental health condition such as high anxiety, OCD, COD, which OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar, psychosis, schizophrenia, and all the other ones stop you from moving forward and enjoying life. And then not just for a week, for longer. And then you really hopefully will look for support. 50% of people do not look for treatment because of the stigma. And so one of the focuses of NAMI is to change it to make sure people know that it's a biochemical, just like diabetes and asthma. It needs frequently treatment, medication, and the other part is therapy, how you see things as part of the treatment and help you develop coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I think something that you said that's really important is that there's unfortunately been A stigma associated with mental illness, and B, mental illness has been treated as if it's distinct from physical illness. And that's really been a tragedy, because that's contributed to the stigma, and then that contributes to lack of access to care, which then makes mental illness so much worse. So we really have a crisis in our country with so many people that have chosen, either out of awareness or out of shame, not to access care. Care is not perfect. We know that. There are side effects. Sometimes they don't work, but at least it's a pathway back to, mental health. And as you mentioned, there's many roads back. There's individual therapy, there's group therapy, there's manual guided therapy, there's therapy over the internet, and medications are very powerful because our brain is bathed in chemicals, just like the whole rest of our body. And oftentimes without medication, we can't come back to that proper chemical balance in our brain, and then we can't see the world properly. And it always, greatly saddens me when I see somebody in my private practice that's been suffering for a long time and never got treatment, and then they can get into treatment and they can make really rapid changes. And as you said, the point of doing that is to then enjoy your life. Mental illness, since it affects how you feel and what you can do, can really affect the quality of life in ways sometimes even greater than physical illnesses.
Right.
I understand the role of NAMI is also to help families. And that's something that in private practice, it can be very difficult to do, or in the office with the patient, but yet a mental illness will obviously affect the whole family. How does NAMI help families?
So what we do is we have classes, we have support groups, we have programs. I personally believe that awareness and education helps give you choices. It's the first step into, and a lot of times some of the problems that people have is expectations or perceptions, and social media has not always helped that, because people don't really get the perspective that they need. Even Dr. Google, by the way, as I call them. But what we do is, and the two important things for human beings, there's many important things, is really not feeling alone, which is connection, and communication. And communication is tough, and it's used in all parts of our life. And when people start struggling in a family, it doesn't matter what the relationship is. It could be a partner spouse, it could be a sibling, it could be most often children. What happens is people don't talk about it, so you feel very alone. And people come to the groups and say, oh my God, and not that I want anybody else to feel miserable, but at least I understand I'm not alone and other people are going through it. And I always say people have a right to be private. They don't have to tell other people. But in these safe groups, confidential, sacred space, we also support clergy. For people of faith, who they turn to is their faith leader of all faiths, doesn't matter what it is. And so because it's been so stigmatized, we have one of our efforts is to offer education and support to clergy, including a retreat every May, Mental Health Month, where clergy who are human beings first, can interface with each other and talk privately, again, in sacred space. And families, we have many, many different things we offer. And it's wonderful to see families change when they get education. Do they change at their own rate? Yes, some take longer, but change takes time. I know you said rapid, that's not so rapid. It's very complex treating mental health conditions. And the good news is, because it is so more recognized, so much more money is going into research. And because one of the things that we teach, or we want people to be aware of, medications are not always easy. And individuals are different chemically, and medications all work differently. It's not like Advil versus Motrin, and you take it and it does a certain thing. You can be put on an antipsychotic or a mood stabilizer, an antidepressant, and it may not work for you. And all that time, that person is feeling the symptoms of whatever the illnesses they have, and they're struggling. And so my heart and my wanting families to understand, to be patient. My 3 Ps, which I don't mind mentioning: perseverance, which most people have; patience, which families and people struggling need to develop. And the third is positivity. When you want to change behavior, look for the strengths. You know, what do we do as human beings? We are go to sometimes criticism and judgment, and we think, ah, and I don't know why we do it. We all do it. It's not something that, you know, and you think it's going to motivate. Just the opposite. It keeps someone just where they are. If you want to motivate somebody, even a kid, look at what they're doing well. You have a 4-year-old in a big playroom and it's all messy, and they put one block on the shelf. You say, ah, I love that you put the block on the shelf, and they'll want to do it more. People go towards what feels good and away what doesn't feel good. And that's a primary thing to remember.
Absolutely. Well, I love that message. And I think, our brains are wired to look for negativity because that's what keeps us alive. And so it's a natural human inclination to want to say, you got to fix that. You did that wrong. And it's a survival instinct. But if we become aware of that, and then we can, choose our response. And absolutely, we do shape our behavior when we feel good and we get positive feedback. It's much more powerfully reinforcing. And I think with people, particularly who have a mental illness, who are struggling, it's very important to try to point out the positives and help them through their illness that way. I know my daughter had brain surgery when she was 5, and art therapy really helped her a lot because that was a place she could express herself and she was able to excel, and it brought up her self-esteem. So I actually have a nonprofit called the Bold Beauty Project, where we pair women with disabilities with photographers and we create art shows. Seems like something we might want to partner with NAMI with at some point. But your work is very important because it helps people understand the situation they're in and then stay positive, because as you say, our treatments for mental illness are good, but they're far from perfect. Man I sort of just ran into had obsessive compulsive disorder, and he gave me this story. He said it's sort of like going into the shoe store and trying on shoes. If you put the first pair on and you get up and you walk around and they're comfortable, buy them and leave the store. But if they're not comfortable, they don't work for you, take them off and put another pair on. And we all know that sometimes, you got to go through 7 pairs before you find that one that really works. And so I always think of that because, you don't want people to have unrealistic expectations that the first pair is going to work for everybody. It's not that simple. But with perseverance, your other P, and patience, your other P, people do get well. And I think that's one of the things that people don't understand about mental illness is that it is treatable. It can go away, but it does require patience, perseverance, and positivity, but you can get there. And that's why I think it's vitally important you support the families, because when you have a mental illness, you're sort of tapped out of your resources. And oftentimes, depending on what mental illness you're suffering from, your insight is impaired. We see this all the time with substance abusers. You ask somebody suffering from an alcohol use disorder, how much do you drink? And they always tell you, really not that much, doc, because their insight is impaired. They don't see themselves accurately. And so mental illness really impacts a family very much. And I think the primary role of NAMI, as I understand it, is education. So it's education for the patient, that this is what you're suffering from, these are the treatments available, and then education and support for the family, because they may have to be the ones who keep taking them back to the shoe store and keep saying, you know what, those don't really fit you, or those don't really look good. Let's try on something else. Because we all know with substance use disorders, it's usually not that first pair that works. And sometimes, we never get it right, and it can be a fatal disorder, but it's families that are so instrumental in getting people to be aware, to come and to try to get help. So I really applaud you in what you're doing. And I hope that people are now more aware. How does somebody find NAMI if they want to reach out to you?
We have a website, NAMI-CLI.org. Or you can, I take crisis calls all the time. You can email me or call me. My email is el.ritz, R-I-T-Z, like the cracker, at yahoo.com. And I get calls from many different states and sometimes a different country. So, and I don't know if I should put my phone number out there, but if anybody wants to email me, then I can give them that information. I do
Now,
want to say a couple of things, if you don't mind.
but
So, you
can I
know,
ask a question about that? My understanding was that NAMI was local chapters. So that,
we're
for
local.
example, I'm in Miami. So if somebody is listening to this from Miami, they would want to reach out to the local chapter. Is that correct? Rather than reaching out to you, or should
Yes,
they
that
reach out to you?
so that would be helpful. What happens is I do get a lot of like Canada, or you come, I have specialty groups, which not every NAMI has. A sibling group, a partner spouse group, a family surviving suicide loss group.
Mhm.
I have peer groups, and which actually a lot of NAMI has, and family groups, which NAMI general. And I have a whole family group, which very rare. It's where the person and my daughter and I started that, where you hear somebody else better than you hear your own family member, whether you're the person who's struggling or the family. A lot of times, the family or the person struggling can say the same thing, and you hear better when someone else says. So it's
Mhm.
been a very helpful, and enlightening uh, thing. So can I go on and
Are,
say, yeah,
are your groups on Zoom or in person
everything
or?
right now is in virtual.
Mhm.
Everything is in virtual
Okay.
because of COVID. And what happened is, I'm going to tell you, there are a few people, we're going to, in the new year, and we have a teen group, by the way. So in the new year, we are going to have a couple of in-person groups, but I had some, and most people want the Zoom. Interesting, right?
Very. It's easier. We've all gotten so lazy. Nobody wants to leave their home, including me. Yeah, our brains are designed to save energy. So now that we've learned to save energy and not leave our homes, our brains are like, yeah, I'm doing that. I'm not doing that. Get dressed and get in a car and drive. That requires a lot of energy. So it's always about understanding our default. So our default is to save energy. It may not be our best decision, though. Our default's not always our best decision. And there really is no substitution for that human contact and connection. What I find as a therapist is what can work beautifully on Zoom, but it also is nice to see people in real life, and you do get more data and you do have a deeper and a different sort of a connection. But I think there's a powerful role for both of them. What if somebody has a loss not due to suicide? Would it be appropriate for them to call NAMI?
There may be some grieving group. This is a very particular group because the loss from suicide, and it doesn't matter what the relationship is very, very painful. And people, these groups, and I don't fault people, but people say some things that are very hurtful to other people, or they disappear because they don't know what to say or they're uncomfortable. And I always say that, look, it's not because that they don't like you. They sometimes don't know. I mean, we've all been there. And when I look back in my early years, I probably said, how old, what happened, and that kind of thing is not really helpful. So feeling that other people understand, it changes you. It
Mhm.
changes you from not being alone. And talking about topics, and we have a topic, that really helps you look at your feelings. And when you look at your feelings, you help move through them more easily. I'm not say easy, but more easily. So there are a lot of things that we do that seem something on the outside, but it really has some deeper meaning as we do them. You mind if I just touch something? I just want to clarify when people are using substances or alcohol, what in the NAMI, in the psychology language, it's self-medicating. We don't ever call it abuse anymore. It is, you're right, another illness, but usually it covers over mental health conditions, majority of the cases. And so unless you treat the mental health condition underneath, you'll never remove the substance use situation. And you just can't remove it either. With therapy, you substitute healthy coping mechanisms to replace the unhealthy coping mechanism. That takes time, it takes work, and it's ups and downs. And to understand, that's where the patience comes in, and understand what the root it may be like. It doesn't happen 1, 2, 3.
No, absolutely not. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, treating substance abuse disorder is complicated. And there's definitely multiple approaches that are needed to help somebody recover from that.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing that's important to understand why it's coming up when most likely when kids become teenagers and late teens and 20s, most of the mental health conditions come out, 75% by the age of 24. That's because the frontal lobe, which is the organizer, it's the impulse control, the judgment, the focus, right? And and so that's where trauma sits also. And so as the frontal lobe develops, it it allows the trauma or the mental health condition to come out. It's usually they're recognizing it a little bit earlier than in the early teens sometimes, but generally they can't put a diagnosis on it except for anxiety and depression, but then that may become something else in the 20s and sometimes 30s. I mean, also, by the way, a lot of families have been coming to me who, or have been noticed that it happens later. Suddenly, they've been fine, they go through life, and sometimes 40s, but mostly in the 50s and 60s and beyond, suddenly a mental health condition, which has never appeared, bipolar, psychosis, depression, just to understand that. And as a nurse, I'm just going to say the first thing you should get when there's a behavioral change or any kind of change is a physical, not a mental health assessment, a physical, just to make sure the chemistries and your oxygenation and all of your organs are in balance so that you can correct that if that's what's causing some of the behavioral change.
Absolutely. Well said. And I think your point is very important that although much mental illness does show up before 25, mental illness can strike at any age, and it can strike in somebody who's had no mental illness before. Great example of that is postpartum depression. A woman may have been completely fine her whole life, very excited to be a mother, and then all of a sudden, gets quite mentally ill in the, days to weeks after her child is born. And that's a condition that can be very severe, but can also be quite treatable. Things that come on quickly can be treated quite quickly, but they can't be treated if people aren't aware of them. So I know a huge mission of NAMI is to make people aware of the variety of mental illnesses, the ways they show up, the times they show up. Depression also is common as we age. Post-traumatic stress disorder is going to show up after your trauma, which can be at any age. So nobody is immune. Just because you can make it to 30 doesn't mean you're immune. It's something that, as you said, is going to affect all of us, either personally or in a family member, because the rates are so high. So it's not something that we want to treat as somebody else's problem. It's not something we want to look down upon. It's something we all should have an education about. And again, I think that the pandemic has helped us with that. And I hope that the participation in NAMI is going up because of the awareness and because of the access through Zoom. And we hope that people today will reach out to either to you, Ellen Ritz, who's been so kind to put your email out there for everybody, and Lou will put it in the link for us, or to look up your local chapter, because there is nothing like that human connection. And so if you yourself are suffering, or you are a family member who's aware of somebody suffering, or if it's a colleague, if there's a colleague you're close with or a longtime friend you're close with, NAMI has open door policy, and they will accept everyone. You also mentioned clergy. So anybody who's working with somebody with mental illness, please tap into these resources. They're there for you. And we really admire you, Ellen, for dedicating so much of yourself to this really valuable organization.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Awareness is what you're doing, is helping people become more aware and hopefully being more open, right?
Yeah.
So thank you.
It's all about being open. Yep. When we're open, then we can find solutions. If we're closed, we can't find solutions to any problems. But I think now everyone's aware that mental health is vitally important, and we have to work together as a family, as a community, as a nation, to meet the needs of those who are suffering.
May I say one more thing, because I know it's up your alley and it's up everybody's alley, should be, is mindfulness. And that means staying in the moment. When we are stressed, and everybody has stress, whether they look at it like it or not, right? Life is ups and downs. But when you have constant stress without taking that moment to stay in the moment, your immune system gets weaker. And that's not what we want with all the illnesses and viruses and everything else around. So give yourself not like just a gift. It should be essential part of your day to take. I don't care if it's 5 minutes, half hour, staying in the moment. It could be yoga, it could be meditation, but it doesn't have to be that. Something that you like, you enjoy, looking at the tree, no leaves left on any trees anymore, but the colors, leaves, flowers in the spring, eating a good meal, playing with the dog, whatever that is for you. And it's very personal. You have to figure that out, and there's no right or wrong to it. So,
and it's also not one thing. You want to
not one thing ever.
tools. You want to say, you know, right now I want to do the 5-minute meditation. In an hour, I want to sit down and be really present and pay attention to the food I'm eating and the company I'm with. And then afterwards, I want to go into my room and listen to some calm music. And then I'm going to take a bubbly bath and I'm going to have a great night's sleep. So it's something that really, when the stress is high, needs to be integrated throughout our day. And the stress is high for all of us right now. So we have to have multiple, I like to say we have to have multiple tools in our toolbox, and we've got to be pulling them out and accessing them. And I think you're acutely aware of that as the president of NAMI, because you see people when they're under stress, that's when they're coming to you. And also as a nurse, you understand that if we don't treat stress, psychological stress, then it will manifest in our body with stomach issues, heart issues, breathing issues, all sorts of ways it will show up. You mentioned immune system. So today's video was really about letting people know about NAMI, but I hear you saying you want to leave everybody with a tool, and the tool is mindfulness. So if that's not something you're familiar with, you know, Google that, go to Dr. Google, who's not so bad, really. 24/7 free. You can't argue with Dr. Google. Don't believe everything Dr. Google says, but I don't believe anything everybody says anyway. And then work on developing your own toolbox, because it's really vitally important to have each of us have our own optimal mental health. And certainly if you had to have one key word, it would be mindfulness.
Right, absolutely.
Thank you for
Mindfulness and peace. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ellen. Look forward to talking with you in the future.